There are three kinds of single factor ANOVAs. The first one-way independent ANOVA. And again, this is something that you've learned about in the lab. So when we do go into details about the different ANOVAs, this is just like a very quick summary. But when we do go into those details, much of that should be review for you. So the one-way independent ANOVA is used when you have a between subjects factor. Remember that independent variable and factor mean the same thing. And between subjects means you have an entirely different group of people in each level of the factor. So Peter, Paul, and Mary in level 1, Tom, Dick, and Harry in level 2, Larry, Moe, and Curly. Did I already say that one? No, I didn't. Larry, Moe, and Curly in level 3. It's a good thing there's not a fourth level because I would have a hard time coming up with some names. Okay, but of course there could be a fourth level. You just have to have 3 or more levels for a ANOVA. So that means you're going to compare 3 or more means. For a one-way repeated ANOVA, this would be used when you have a within subjects factor. So you still have just one factor, but it's within subjects. And that factor, of course, has to have 3 or more means to compare. So there's 3 or more levels. Within subjects means the exact same people are tested in each level. So Peter, Paul, and Mary, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Peter, Paul, and Mary. However many different levels you have, it's the same people in each one. Now, we have a special name for the ANOVA when it's different people in each group and they have been paired or matched. And it's called a one-way randomized blocks ANOVA, right? And actually, this is kind of cool, and it really makes sense to give this its own separate name, because remember that when we learned, about t-tests, the dependent t-test is run in one of 2 situations. The first situation is where you have a within subjects factor, so you have the exact same people in each level, and there's only 2 means to compare. That would be a dependent t-test. But remember, there's another situation where you would be using a dependent t-test. And that's the situation where you've used pairing or matching. In other words, a matched design. And that, of course, is when you have different people in each group, but they've been paired or matched on some extraneous variable. All right. And you would run a dependent t-test if that were the case. Now, here's the thing. If I tell you I ran a dependent t-test, you wouldn't know from that information alone, you wouldn't know whether my independent variable was within subjects or was it a matched design. So were they different people in each group, but paired? All right. If we're talking about a t-test, we would say they've been paired because you pair them up 2 by 2. Right. So ANOVA kind of, whoever, came up with ANOVAs, actually his name was Fisher, but he was pretty smart because he said we should give this its own separate name. So when you are comparing 3 or more means of a factor, if you've used matching, we're going to call it a one-way randomized blocks. And you'll understand why the name randomized blocks, why that makes sense later in the lecture, okay? Now, one piece of good news, I suppose, is that regardless of whether it's a one-way randomized blocks or a one-way repeated ANOVA, it's analyzed and interpreted the exact same way, all right? So it's just to help the reader know in advance what the factor was. Was it within subjects or was it, between subjects but with matching? All right. Now, one other little FYI here. When you use matching in an ANOVA, you would use the word matching. You wouldn't use pairing because pairing implies that you only have to find for your first participant, you need to find one other person, with the exact same values of the extraneous variable, right? You pair them 2 by 2, and then one goes to one group, the other person goes to the remaining group. But that's true when you have t-tests. But when you have an ANOVA, you have to group people in sets of 3, because if you have 3 means, 3 levels, you're going to have to group them in sets of 3, because one needs to go to level 1, the other one would go to level 2, and the third one would go to level 3. If you have 4 levels in your ANOVA, that means you have to group people in sets of 4. All right. And so we don't use the word pairing when we're talking about, that technique. We don't use the word pairing in ANOVA. We say matching. If you're using a t-test, then pairing or matching can be used. All right. Little quick question for you here, just to make sure that we understand, what does the word one in one way refer to? So one way independent ANOVA, one way repeated, one way randomized blocks. What does this mean? It means you have one independent variable, okay? One factor. That's why these designs are called single factor ANOVAs. All right, the statistical test is single factor. You have one IV. All right. If this said two-way, that would mean you have 2 factors or 2 independent variables. If this said 3-way, it means you have 3 factors, etc.